Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program. My name is Kaylor Sweeney, and I serve as the Common Ground Initiative Program Manager at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. Before we begin, I would be remiss if I did not thank those whose work and support made tonight's event possible. I want to recognize my colleagues at the Hauenstein Center, as well as Grand Valley's facilities, information technology, catering, and event services staff, and others whose work behind the scenes ensure a successful event. Thank you as well to our Hauenstein Center members, whose support allows us to endeavor on our mission of raising a community of ethical and effective leaders for the 21st century. As this is a Common Ground Initiative event, I want to recognize the diversity of viewpoints present in the auditorium today. Created in response to growing political polarization, the Common Ground Initiative works to bring people together to engage in good faith dialogue across ideological divides and policy issues. We work hard to represent a variety of thoughts in our programming, but there is no stage large enough to represent the full diversity of thought on the increasingly complex issues we face today as a nation. In recognizing this weakness, I invite you to lend your voice to the discussion by engaging in tonight's Q&A, staying for the post-event reception, and to continue your dialogue with friends, families, and colleagues in the days and weeks to come. Our panel this evening brings an incredible depth of knowledge to tonight's topic, but their discussion, we hope, will only be the first step to a larger conversation. As some of you may know, a key component of the Hauenstein Center's programming is the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. Every year, a cohort of student leaders join us for a unique leadership development experience. At each of our events, we invite one of the fellow candidates to present a leadership minute, a brief reflection on their personal leadership journey. It is my privilege to introduce you to CLA fellow candidate Iris Kokalari to share her leadership minute and then introduce our moderator for the evening. Iris is an international student of Albanian Italian heritage. She is currently studying mechanical engineering at Grand Valley State, and she hopes to stay in the area after graduation and gain industry experience before starting a career as a project manager. She works for Housing as an RA, for the School of Engineering as a student worker, and for Magna Mears in Holland as an intern during her co-op semesters. She is also the membership chair for the National Society of Black Engineers and for the American Association of Mechanical Engineers chapters at GV. Her student organization involvement stems from being passionate about community, especially for minority students who need a support system during college. Please join me in welcoming Iris.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Iris Kokalari, and I am a third culture kid, or as I prefer to call myself, a double immigrant. My family immigrated from Albania to Italy in 1999, so just a year before I was born, and I moved to the United States in 2019 as an international student. My family story and mine are very different, and while living in the United States by myself has not been easy, my story does not compare in the slightest to what my parents had to go through. My parents' story is made of hardships, sacrifices, and dedication, and I'm incredibly grateful that they gave me a life where I always have a choice. I want to thank the Cook Leadership Academy for empowering me and other students to pursue leadership and to choose courage, because being an ethical leader does take a lot of courage. Expressing your opinion when someone might not want you to takes courage. Paying attention to what is happening in the world and caring about it takes courage. I also want to thank the Hauenstein Center for organizing events where students get the chance to witness how you handle difficult conversations with grace and with tact. I'm particularly excited for today's event, Bipartisan Policy Panel on Immigration, because I know that today the conversation will be stimulating and respectful. Unfortunately, this is not always the case with talks revolving immigration, because sometimes people don't realize or don't care that conversations become unethical and unproductive when the people at the very center of them are dehumanized, because we are talking about people and not about abstract policies. As you are about to partake in a bipartisan policy panel, I want to share a quote by someone I'm inspired by, Musine Kokalari. Musine was one of the first female writers in Albania, the co-founder of the first Albanian Social Democratic Party, and a relentless voice in the fight for democracy and free elections. Musine was accused of being an enemy of the people, and she was thus arrested in 1946 by the communist forces which took control of Albania after the liberation from the fascist occupation. During her trial, she famously said, "You boast that you have won the war, and now that you are the winner, you want to extinguish those who you call political opponents. I think differently from you, but I love my country. You are punishing me for my ideals." I am inspired by Musine's memory by my parents' story and by my own immigration experiences to be an empowered citizen, which to me means staying active, staying aware, and staying passionate. For example, not a day goes by without me thinking about the atrocities being committed in Palestine, and I refuse to not express my opinion about it. Freedom of speech is a right and a duty, and I will never allow anyone to take it from me, nor will I ever give up on it because of fear or indifference. I want to urge everyone to stay informed and to not turn your backs to the injustice being committed, both in the small of your communities and in the big of the world. Don't let anyone take your freedom of speech from you, but remember that it is both a right and a duty, and that the only ethical way to approach discourse and disagreement is through a compassionate lens to the condition of fellow humans. My name is Iris Kokalari, and I am a leader. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening. Megan Rydecki serves as the director of the Hauenstein Center. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations and a Master's in Public Administration, both from Grand Valley State University. Prior to joining the Hauenstein Center, Megan spent time in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, serving at the City of Wyoming, International City County Management Association, The Right Place, CQL, and most recently, Consumers Energy. Her community involvement is extensive, highlighted by service to Grand Rapids, Whitewater, the Grand Rapids Public Museum, and the Board of Trustees at Grand Valley State University. These experiences have allowed Megan to recognize the leadership potential in everyone, and she is dedicated to empowering the next generation of leaders for the betterment of the world. In her free time, Megan enjoys traveling with her husband, Noel, playing with her dog, Sir Edmund, running with friends, and enjoying community. Please join me in welcoming Megan.
I am really pleased that you are all here to join us for this really timely and important discussion. I'm going to briefly introduce our guests who are with us tonight, but I'm going to direct you to your program for the full bio and also to the back page, which has information about each of the organizations that our colleagues up here represent, and a lot more data, which is an important thing that you can collect from there as well. So without further ado, we're going to dive in and get started. To my left is David Bier from the Cato Institute. In the middle, we have, oh my gosh, Theresa Cardinal Brown from the Bipartisan Policy Center.
I have 3 names, it's hard to remember.
It's okay, you practice these things, and then you get up here and your brain just, And then we also have Aaron Reichlin-Melnick from the American Immigration Council. So thank you all for joining us. We're looking forward very much to hearing from you. So just as a reminder, we're gonna discuss for about 45, 50 minutes, and then we're gonna turn to Q&A. So as you think about your questions, write them down, get them ready, but we definitely wanna hear from all of you, including the folks who are watching from home or online. So get those questions ready. We're gonna be happy to discuss. So to get started, to set the stage, literally and figuratively, the scale of American immigration is sometimes difficult to make sense of. What statistic do you believe is important to understanding the topic, and what story does that number tell? And David, I'm staring at you, so we'll start right here.
0.3%. That's the percentage of our population that became new legal permanent residents last year. This number, in absolute terms, is 1 million people. But as a share of our population, it's a tiny fraction. And if you look back in history, you will see times in our history in the late 19th and early 20th century where we commonly allowed legal immigration in excess of 1% of our population. At the highest point, it was at 1.5% of our population. So in today's terms, 1% is 3.3 million people. And it really reflects the state of our immigration policy. It really does not reflect the founding of our country, which George Washington saw as an asylum for mankind, a policy that invited people and welcomed people from around the world to participate in the freest country in the world. And I think when you reflect on that tiny percentage and how much debate goes into how are we going to split that share and are we going to rearrange it just so, maybe we can think, maybe we should be a little bit bigger in our conception of America and think maybe a growing country is not a bad thing, it's a great thing. And in the face of our future, where the United States is staring in the face of population decline, immigration is going to be really the heart of economic growth and prosperity in the future.
Thank you. Theresa.
My number is 7.6 million. That's the number of people currently waiting in that green card backlog. As David mentioned, our legal immigration system admits around 1 million new immigrants a year, but we have 7 times that amount waiting. But that number doesn't tell the whole story, because the people at the end of that waiting line may not actually get a green card for their entire lifetimes. Because we also, of that 7.6 million, about 2.9 million of them are just processing. We're waiting on the government to process their applications. Others are based on the limits that were set in statute, and those limits can't be changed by Congress changing them, so they may die before they ever get a green card. So aside from the number of new immigrants we think we ought to have, I would argue we need to have a system that actually allows them to come in. Because if you are trying to wait in the legal immigration line, and that line tells you you're not going to get in before you die, what's the point? And that's one of the reasons why people don't bother waiting in that line and try to come in illegally. So we have to think about the consequences of setting caps and how we process people. One last number that I'll throw out there, those 7.6 million people waiting in green card lines, if we were to clear that backlog today, having them be productive members of our economy would give us $3.9 trillion in GDP gains over the next 10 years. So we're sacrificing economic growth on the altar of a non-functional immigration system.
Very helpful. Aaron, what do you have for us? What's the number of the evening?
Yeah, well, I mean, this was a tricky one because the immigration system has so many numbers to choose from. And we actually had a conversation before this even started about which numbers we pick. I thought for a moment about using 3.3 million, which is the number of people in immigration court right now, or potentially 1.4 trillion, which is the spending power of immigrants in the United States. But instead, I want to build up on the thing about caps that Theresa just mentioned here, and you go with 10,000. 10,000 is an arbitrary number that Congress picked 23 years ago when it decided to create a visa for people, primarily undocumented immigrants, who came forward and reported being the victim of a serious crime and who worked with law enforcement. See, 23 years ago, Congress said, we want to give these people a path to remaining in the United States. We shouldn't be deporting someone. If someone's the victim of a serious assault and they go and they help the police and they get someone convicted and behind bars, we should have an option for these people. But then Congress said, well, how many people should we let have this status? And they picked 10,000 arbitrarily. Well, as it turns out, there are actually much more than 10,000 people in the United States who are undocumented every year who come forward and they help law enforcement. And so after this law went into effect, the backlog started growing, and it started growing quickly. And today, there are more than 180,000 people who are waiting in backlogs, who have been approved for this status, who are most of them undocumented, who are just waiting for 10,000 in front of them. And every year that line in front of them gets 10,000 shorter, but every year more than 10,000 people get in line behind them. And this is a way in which the system is really inflexible, and people who we have these good ideas about, who we think as a country that we should give them some path to status, so we tell them, well, you'll get it eventually. And beyond that, it's not just 10,000, it's also how long people are having to take just to get in that line. Right now, if you are the victim of a serious crime and you're undocumented, you come forward, you work with the police say, this person helped us, and you file your application with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, they won't even look at your application for 5 years. And then after 5 years, they'll look at your application and they'll say, all right, Great. But at this point, now there's 250,000 people in the line. So in 25 years, you're going to get that visa. And that is an example, I think, one of the more obvious and like easy to explain examples and stories of how our immigration system isn't working as we intend.
Thank you. So I think for a lot of us these days, when we think about immigration, we think of the southern border, because that's what we hear about. But obviously, as you can tell already, we want to paint a much broader picture for what we're actually talking about. So along those lines, why are we talking about the immigration system? What is it meant to accomplish? And do you think it's been successful? And Theresa, we'll start with you.
What is it meant to accomplish? That's a really good question. I think we don't know, and that's part of the problem. If somebody said, what's the mission statement of our immigration system, I'm not sure I could tell them, because it's trying to do a lot of different things and frankly doesn't do any of them very well. On one hand, we have a system where we want to have families be able to reunify. So if you're a US citizen, you can sponsor your foreign spouse or children for a green card. You can sponsor your parent for a green card. If you have a green card, you can sponsor your spouse and kids for a green card. About 60% of our green cards are based on that family reunification. So clearly that's an important part of our system. We also want visas to go to help our economy. So we have another set of criteria for people who would come to fill a job. That's a much smaller number. It's only about 17% of our total green cards are based on somebody coming to fill a job in the United States. We have a part of our immigration system that's for protecting people who would suffer persecution abroad. That's refugees and asylees. We have a part of our immigration system that's supposedly about diversifying who comes to the United States. It's a lottery. So if you ask me what's our immigration system about, I'm like, it's about all kinds of things. But the one important thing is that those decisions about what it's about were made decades ago. The family employment-based ratios were set in 1965. The caps were last updated in 1990. Our refugee process was set in 1980. Our border system was set in 1996. So, and is any of this working the way it needs to work today, or we'd want it to work today? I would argue no. But we have to figure that out. I think every generation has to figure that out, probably more than once a generation, but waiting that long to figure out all those pieces is a recipe for nothing working. And I think that's where we're at right now.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Well, I think the primary purpose of our immigration system is to keep people out of the United States. If you look at the history of our immigration laws, they really start with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 19th century. This is the first major piece of immigration legislation. It was designed to exclude almost all Chinese from being able to immigrate. It was really the test case for the nativist movement in the United States. How are we going to create the bureaucracy to enforce this provision of law? They came up with visas and consular interviews, and we're going to exclude this whole race of people from coming to the country. In 1924, they replicated that bill for the world. Basically, they said, we're going to allow almost no one, we're going to have a few exceptions, it's going to be effectively a worldwide exclusion act, and then a few people are going to come through. If you look at before 1924, setting aside the Chinese, about 98% of the people who applied to come in legally as a permanent resident were approved and received a green card. Today, that number is about 3% of all the people who are trying to get a green card through all the paths we heard, the refugee path, the lottery, all of these different paths that we have, about 3% will actually make it through in any given year. So the primary purpose of our immigration laws are to keep people out, not to have a way for them to come in. All the little paths out there are not meant to be followed by most people. They're meant to exclude all the people that we don't want. And the people who we don't want are apparently 97% of the people who want to come. And that's, of course, why we have such a huge problem at the border, why we have debates about what are we going to do with the 2 million or so who come across the border illegally. And so we need to reorient ourselves and ask the question again, at a fundamental basis, who do we want to allow to be part of our society? So we can answer the question, when someone comes across the border illegally, what should we do with them? Because if we haven't answered that fundamental question in a century, really, we picked a random number and said, this is the number we're going to allow. You end up with really perverse consequences that no one really chose, no one really gave much thought to.
Yeah, I mean, I think a really interesting point about the roots of immigration law. And if you look at where modern immigration law comes from legally, it comes from exclusion. It comes from laws like fundamentally racist Supreme Court decisions from the 19th century that said that Chinese nationals would never be able to become Americans. And, that were really rooted in this late 19th century conception of white identity. And that persisted in immigration law for an enormous amount of time. But I do think it's important to note the shift that really happened in 1965. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act was an acknowledgement that 1924 was wrong. And it was part and parcel of the Civil Rights Revolution. It came the same years as the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And so you see that and Lyndon Johnson at the time said, this is basically part of this. We have had a discriminatory system that judged people on the basis of where they were born. And he said, with this pen, we are abolishing that system and that every person can be viewed on their own. Now, of course, as David points out, that still fundamentally rested on the idea that we're only going to let in some number of people and everybody else can't come. But I think if you look at the origins there and the intent of it, did they succeed at that? Well, not necessarily. But I think they have. What has happened is that the United States is more diverse than it has ever been in the past. We have now a multiracial democracy in a way that we have never had before. And I think that is down to immigration. And I think it's been a huge positive for the United States. And of course, we have been here before in some ways. In 1890, 14.8% of the US population was foreign-born. That's basically where it is today. And so we have been there, and we saw it similarly in some parts of history repeating itself. We saw xenophobia around it. We saw an urge to crack down, to close the border, to limit. And the question is whether we're going to go down the same path we went 100 years ago, or whether we can learn from the lessons of history and find a better path that's more, I think, in keeping with how we see ourselves as the country today in a way we didn't 130 years ago.
I want to put a point on something, though. I don't want to deify the 1965 Act as all of that. Mm-hmm. Because the 1965 Act is why we have 2/3 of all green cards going to family reunification, not because of some great idea of family values, but in order to get it past the divided Congress. And if you go back and look at the congressional record for the debate of the law, the idea was that if the people already in the United States were sponsoring the new immigrants, then guess what? The faces of the United States wouldn't change that much. Now, it didn't work out that way because it did diversify, but it wasn't created to be that way. And one of the issues that I see a lot is that there's this divide in a lot of the people who talk about immigration, like, well, should we have family sponsorship be the primary way most immigrants come in the United States, or should it be economic based? And I don't want to say that families should not be able to be reunified, but that means that immigrants are sponsoring immigrants and families are sponsoring families. That's great. But most Americans want to see immigration be more about our economic benefits. Now, you can argue whether that's dehumanizing or anything. I'm not going to say one way or another, but the polling shows that people will be more supportive of a system when they see how it benefits them. And most people see the system right now. How is it benefiting America? We have to make we have to keep making this case that immigration is good for us because our system doesn't show it. Immigration has been good for us economically. It is very good for us. And we've all done research to prove that. But if you just look at our immigration system, it's unclear why that's the case. Because the system doesn't scream on its face, This is a system designed to help America. And I think that's one of the reasons we have a lot of debate about it, is because a lot of Americans look at this and go, we don't understand how it helps us. If we had more direct, like a way that our system was designed, and look at countries like Canada, UK, Australia, other countries, they put the economic case for their immigration system up front. And they say, we're selecting people based on how they're going to contribute to our economy. They, by the way, Canada admits more on a per capita basis of family immigration than we do, even though their system is fundamentally based on economic benefits. So go figure. You can have both. You can have both.
So can we unpack this sort of self-interested bit a little bit? Because, you know, if we think about our country, probably almost everyone in the room is either an immigrant themselves or a descendant of immigrants. There's very few of us in the room likely who were here from the beginning. So, and we love an immigrant story, right? Somebody comes here with $17 in their pocket, and now they're, you know, the CEO of a tech company. We love these stories. So how is it that we start as a nation of immigrants and we find ourselves having these conversations now where we can't pass policy because people don't see what's in it for them? How did we get here?
How did we get here?
Well, I think a lot of it, frankly, is the inertia of policy that, you know, was created in the 1920s at a certain place in time, and we've kind of been stuck in that sort of same frame. Yeah, we did 1965, that made it a little bit more equal for people to get into that, but the reality is, once you have a certain policy in effect, once the basic premise is most people are going to be excluded here, so we got to figure out how to cut up the pie a little bit differently and change who gets selected, and that gets really dicey because then you're starting, I'm going to take from you and I'm going to give to you, and nobody likes that. And I think the fundamental issue now is most people aren't even having the debate about legal immigration. When they think about immigration, they think about the people coming across the border. And so that's de facto a huge part of our immigration system today is people coming across the border. And it's that part of the immigration system that does create backlash because people see the how disorderly it is, the chaos. They see people running away from law enforcement and they think, well, why is he running away from law enforcement? Maybe he has something to hide, or maybe he's just trying to come into work and he really wants a job, whatever the case might be. And I think it's the disorder, it's the illegality, it's these things that create a visceral response in people, and they look at the legal immigration system and they think, we're just going to add more people on top of all the chaos and disorder that I see at the border. And I think that's sort of the nexus between the two, where we have to figure out some way to change how people come to this country. Because look, right now, it's about 2/3 of the people entering the country on a semi-permanent basis are showing up at the border. We need to change that. We need to think about, well, how do we do this in a more organized, orderly way, or we're going to end up with a lot of people who come here. We tried to stop them. It created more chaos. We arrested them. We spent all this law enforcement resources trying to stop them from getting here. Then when they're released from custody into the United States to pursue an asylum claim, or because we couldn't deport them fast enough, then they can't work legally and they can't support themselves, and it taxes local communities. So there are problems in our immigration system. I just think they stem a lot from the fact that we spend all of our time at the border and figuring out how to stop people, as opposed to look at the framework of our immigration laws and have a debate about who should be able to come and under what conditions, and maybe have a little bit larger of a system than we do now.
I would also add that activating people's sense of belonging and welcoming is more difficult than activating their sense of fear. And in a system where engagement and it bleeds, it leads has essentially dominated the media landscape, and social media in particular, it is very hard to tell more nuanced stories, to tell stories of people who struggle to come here, who tell stories of people stuck in backlogs, or who come across the border because they're fleeing persecution, or who simply come across the border, as people have done for generations, to seek a job and a better life in the American dream. And that just makes it difficult to have these kind of nuanced conversations. And I think the best example of this is the way that many people, I think, sort of feel why should, my ancestors came the right way. Why should these people not do that? Why aren't they going that? And you see Theresa laughing because right now, most of the time, of course, pre-1924, the right way was literally show up at Ellis Island, and 98% of people who came through Ellis Island were admitted. And so for them, there
Or
wasn't...
freely crossed the U.S.-Mexico border until 1924.
Exactly.
We didn't enforce immigration
We didn't
at the
have
border
a border
until
patrol before 1924.
1924.
Though we had some. There was actually
Local.
groups of people called Chinese catchers,
Yes.
because even then,
Chinese.
that is actually the group that sort of became the border patrol. A lot of them, because there were people who came across, because a lot of people who got turned away by the Chinese Exclusion Act had been living in the United States for years without legal status. In fact, it wasn't until 1952 that non-white immigrants were allowed to become citizens. 1790 to 1952, the Naturalization Act said only free white persons could become US citizens. And so I think people don't understand, because we have internalized the nation of immigrants mythology, that actually we live in a world right now that is way more restrictive than most of our ancestors had to go through. And people still think, oh, well, if you're a good person, you just go through a process, you get in line, you wait your turn, you'll get it. But it just doesn't work that way. And until people internalize that, then I think it makes it very hard to have these conversations, because people do feel, why should you get to come in when my mom is waiting outside, when my sister is waiting outside? Because the backlogs and delays just keep people stuck. And I think that breeds resentment. And even though we should understand that a lot of people we should be in this together, I think, but that's just harder to get. Welcoming and belonging is difficult. It's a practice. You have to really, really do it intentionally. But fear and resentment is a lot easier to activate, especially among politics.
Well, and the other thing is that for our policymakers, particularly in Congress, it's really easy to get money for law enforcement. It's really hard to get money for adjudication, right? It's easy to say, oh, I put another $1 billion into Border Patrol, and I worked at CBP. I respect those people immensely. But at the moment, what we need instead of more Border Patrol is we need people to adjudicate the cases of the border people that are turning themselves into the Border Patrol. Because what Border Patrol is ending up doing is releasing people into an ever-growing, interminable backlog of cases in immigration court. Because the immigration court has been funded at levels probably not even a tenth of what Border Patrol has been funded over the last 2 decades. So
it's actually currently about a tenth, 8.8
There you
million
go.
Border Patrol, 865 million for immigration courts, so slightly less than a tenth.
there you go. And
Yeah.
the immigration courts are now at 3 million cases, and they finish about 300,000 a year, give or take. So you do the math. But you're not going to get, the other thing that's worth understanding is that when we think about the US-Mexico border, and we tend, for better or for worse, most Americans, their frame of reference for all immigration discussions is the border. But it's about a decade out of date. And I say that because until the mid-2010s, 99% of everybody that was ever encountered at the US-Mexico border was Mexican. And they were usually single adults, usually men, trying to come into work. They were trying to avoid getting caught by Border Patrol. And so we designed, I said our border system was last updated in 1996. We designed our system essentially to take people into custody and rapidly return them back to Mexico. We created a small exception for anybody who claimed that they might be subject to persecution, that you could claim asylum at the border. And we made clear that you can claim asylum even if you've entered illegally, because we want to make sure that, heaven forbid, we send somebody back to persecution, because we believe in that stuff. But what has happened in the decades since is that the majority are no longer Mexican. They're not even necessarily single adults. They're families with small children. And the majority are turning themselves into Border Patrol to seek this one exception for asylum. That means our entire framework for how we manage the border is now obsolete. The number one nationality at the border right now is Venezuelans. And we have the largest number of people not even from the hemisphere arriving at the border. we were just talking about, from Africa, from Senegal and Cameroon and Congo and Mauritania, from India and China, from all around the world are now coming to the US-Mexico border because they see that's the way you come to the United States. So yes, we need to fix our legal immigration system, but we do have to turn the tide on this right now, because now it is no longer a poor Mexican who's hoping to better their life by coming to the United States and working for a while. We have sophisticated transnational criminal organizations that are encouraging migration through pathways around the world to come to the United States. And we have nation states like Nicaragua that are encouraging this by having visa-free travel for anybody from Cuba or Haiti or any of the African nations to come fly visa-free to Nicaragua, and you can make your way to the border from there. So we have to figure out what we do at the border. It'd be nice if we could wait till we could figure out our legal immigration system, but I think we have to focus on what we can do at the border. And there are things we can do. Actually, I want to amend that. We can't do it at the border. If we wait till everybody comes to the border to figure out what we're going to do, that's too late. We have to figure out how we're going to work with other countries in the hemisphere. We have to figure out how we're going to engage in law enforcement to go after these criminal cartels, which are, by the way, some of the same cartels that are bringing drugs. Immigrants are not mostly bringing drugs. US citizens are bringing drugs, but the cartels are making money on both. That's where we need to focus a lot of our time and energy. Putting more people at the border. If you have come from Congo or from Darfur to the US-Mexico border, a Border Patrol agent is not gonna, and stops you and says you can't come in. You're not gonna go, oh, okay, I'm just gonna go back. You're like at the border. You're gonna stay there and figure out a way to get in. So we can't make that the place where we have our last stand. Like, it's never gonna work. It's never has worked. We need to figure out a better system.
Yeah. So I feel like we could dive into national security and the southern border, but I really want to hear from all of you what needs to be different. I know all of you have some pretty specific policy solutions and ideas for where we need to go to improve the system. So let's go there. What are specific recommendations you would each support that would better align our system with the interests of the American public? And to what extent should we also weigh the interests of the people who want to come? How should that affect? And David, I'll let you start.
Okay, I don't think it's in the interest of Americans to be spending tens of billions of dollars to keep people who want to contribute to this country out. It's our money. We shouldn't be spending it to house a bunch of people who cross the border. We need to come up with a better legal immigration system. And that's where I would put my priority. A lot of people in Congress who are pro-immigrants or whatever say we need to work on a path to citizenship for people who are already here. I would focus on the people who want to come, because that's really the crisis right now is people coming and how are they going to come. And so for me, my priority is fixing the way in which people come. And right now, our system is so restrictive. I mean, rearranging a few things is not going to cut it. That's not going to solve the problem. We're still going to be dealing with all the people and spending all this money on people coming to the border. We need to focus on the big picture, which is it's that 3% of the people who are trying to come legally get it. And not enough people can even many of the people can't even apply under the current system. So we need to focus on fixing the legal immigration system first. I would start with our own hemisphere, just because that's the vast majority of the people who are coming illegally to the United States are from our own hemisphere. Having a policy that allowed them to come and work legally in the United States would be a fantastic first step to getting rid of this transnational syndicate that controls migration through the Americas. If we had done that with Mexico, we wouldn't even have this problem, because they wouldn't have built up this whole smuggling network that goes all the way 1,000 miles from Guatemala up through Mexico. But we didn't, so then Central Americans started to come and we cracked down on them. That only empowered the cartels even more because they could raise more fees to get people across. Then they built that network out into Panama and into South America, and now we're dealing with even more people. But I think starting with the premise that people should be able to come and work in this country legally as a presumption, especially for people within our own hemisphere, would do far more than anything else we could do with law enforcement to fix the problems that we have in our immigration system. And I see the problems as chaos, illegality, and the inability of people who get here to be able to support themselves legally because they don't have the right to work.
I don't necessarily disagree. I think we need to do a bunch of things at the same time. I think, when I first started engaging in immigration policy in the mid-1990s, we had this idea called comprehensive immigration reform, or CIR. And it was based on dealing with three things, all of which were seen as equally important because they were all interrelated. One was reforming our legal immigration system, update it for what we need today, numbers and categories, and try to make it mesh more with what we needed as a country. The second was addressing the status of what was then, in the mid-1990s, about 7 or 8 million undocumented immigrants. We're now between 10.5 and 11 million undocumented immigrants. Through some form of legalization, path to citizenship. I don't like that phrase because people believe that we're handing out citizenship. Nobody has to get citizenship. It's not automatic. It's a separate process. You get them legal. That's the most important part. And then the last part was, what do we do about enforcement? At the border, in the interior, but basically, how do we, if we create this new system, how do we enforce the integrity of that system so that there is less illegality? Over the years, as those attempts at doing that tried and failed under George W. Bush 3 times, under Barack Obama at least twice, the idea that we could do all three became harder and harder to conceive of in Congress. And so then we started talking about, well, we'll just do a legalization and border deal. And during the Trump administration, that was actually tried, at least for the undocumented children, the people who came as children, the Dreamers or DACA. There was a deal that was offered by Democrats in Congress to give President Trump $25 billion for the border wall in exchange for legalizing the Dreamers. And at the end of the day, he didn't take that deal. He wanted more. He wanted to restrict immigration more. And so the deal fell apart. But losing out on the legal immigration system or restricting it more is the opposite of what's going to bring more legality to the system. And I think that we are dealing with that. I mean, the other piece that I didn't mention is that for many of the migrants coming to the border right now, they don't even know there's a legal option. Like, they don't even know. There was a story that I was talking to a reporter from Al Jazeera about this Venezuelan man who had a child with a birth defect. He had fled Venezuela because he couldn't get medicine for his daughter. He had lived in Ecuador and Guatemala, odd jobs, trying to find medical care for her. At the end of the day, he said, I have no choice, and he tried to come to the US border to seek asylum because he heard that he could ask for asylum and get medical treatment for his daughter. They got to the border and his daughter died before they could get to the border to seek asylum. And so now he's in Mexico and grieving. And I said, the ironic thing is that we actually give humanitarian parole to people seeking desperate medical treatment in the United States every day. If he had been able to get to an embassy and ask for this, he might have been able to fly him and his daughter to the United States. And he had no idea that that was possible. So, we have now created this understanding in most of the world, because of the restrictedness, that the only way to come to the United States is to make your way to the border. And again, yes, there are criminal organizations that are facilitating this idea. But one of the things we need to do is do a better job of being in the places where migrants are before they undertake the journey to say, maybe there is an option. Where there isn't, we need to create some. We have had a debate for 40 years in this country about whether we have temporary workers or permanent residents. And I'm like, why? Why? 2 times comprehensive immigration bills failed in Congress because one side said only green cards and the other side said temporary visas, and they couldn't come to agreement. Why not both? What's the issue? Why do we have to say you can only come and work temporarily? If you've come and worked temporarily for 10 years, at that point, why not get a green card? And most Americans would go, that makes sense to me. You've proven that you can stay and work and you're part of you're supporting yourself. Why not? But we have these debates because it's like, oh, well, if you're on a temporary visa, maybe you're going to get taken advantage of or you're going to undercut American workers. We can figure out ways around that. But if you can only come on a green card, some people don't want to stay. Some people want to go back. Why are we forcing that choice? Like, I feel like so much of the debate is about these absolute positions. It's either this or that. It's either an open border or we keep everyone out. It's, everyone gets asylum or no one gets asylum. Like, no, there's a whole lot of room in between, but we feel like we don't get to have those conversations anymore.
Yeah, I mean, no, I'm fired up from that.
Am I wrong? Am I wrong, people?
I'm fired up from that too, because it is very frustrating to see these debates about open border, closed border. The border is not open. Like, an open border is one that you can walk across, like, without any issue. An open border is a border between our states, or it's in Europe, the Schengen zone, where you can literally just cross international borders and no one's there to look at your passport. Like, Americans know what open borders look like. We have 50 different states that you can travel in between, crossing the borders between those states, and no one's tracking that, no one's knowing it. That's what an open border is. What we have is a weirdly closed border, a border where we have where people, of course, as they have for 100 years, cross in violation of immigration law. That is not new. That's something that's been happening for 100 years. And nowhere in the past has anyone said, in 1980, nobody said we had an open border. Or maybe some people did, to be fair. But the point is that we have a system, and the system right now is just a weird one because it's based on this 1996 idea that it's just not working for what is going on right now. So, when it comes to solutions, what we have said is the right answer is not what is the silver bullet, what is it going to solve this tomorrow. The right question to ask is what can we do now to help solve this problem in the future? Because we have to acknowledge that this is a global displacement crisis. Right now, there are more people displaced globally than at any point in human history. And a lot of that's in this hemisphere. Until the war in Ukraine happened, Venezuelans were the number one country for displaced nationalities. 7.7 million Venezuelans have left in the last decade. That is 1 in 4 people in the entire country have left. And now most of them are not here. Most of them are in South America. But if you think about it, not surprisingly, they've started coming to the United States. And once those paths have been built, it is enormously difficult to dismantle them. And then you get into diplomacy, and you have to deal with the fact that for years, the United States just hasn't had to deal with large-scale displacement in a way that other countries around the world have dealt with for generations. Jordan, 1 in 3 people, I think, in Jordan is a displaced person. We are per capita not taking the most refugees and asylum seekers at all. Other countries take a lot more and put themselves through a lot higher burdens, and so are much more realistic about this question, about how do you build this capacity? How do you ensure that people have stability and safety and can integrate? But because we're stuck in this paradigm of Mexican migration, we aren't asking these right questions. So for specific policy proposals, one of the things that we've called for is a Center for Migrant Coordination within DHS or the White House, where we could have the federal government actually take a leading role in migrant arrivals, rather than what's happening today, which is that once someone leaves Department of Homeland Security custody, all the federal government cares about is that they check in eventually with ICE. In 6 months from now, just make sure you're in the system, when you come to your court dates. But what you do in between then, it's a free country, you go do whatever you want. That means that when migrants are crossing, they're literally dumped at the border. If they don't have any money, they get on one of Abbott's buses, which are free. And they love that. People love that there are these free buses, but they only take them to 5 or 6 destinations: New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C. and things like that. And that's how people end up in these cities. Or they buy a plane ticket because they hear it's New York, it's the land of opportunity. And so because we don't have the federal government leading there, it means you end up in places where migrants end up in cities that don't have the resources anymore. They did a year ago, a lot of them do not now. And it's really tough to say this because there's a lot of people who've been working for years to build up that capacity. And it was successful. We'd actually got representation rates in immigration court above 60% for the first time ever. And they're now at 35% because the numbers are too high, the capacity is not there anymore. And the problem is because they've all gone to a few locations because they don't know better because the federal government isn't leading. So we think if Congress or the executive creates a center, a place where we can actually coordinate some migrant arrivals, give people resources so that they know, hey, New York is going to kick you out of a shelter in 60 days. But if you go to St. Louis, they're offering opportunities and resources now because they need people. That's the kind of thing that can empower both migrants and help cities and local governments. But right now, unfortunately, because of the political liabilities, the Biden admin is not leading. So we kind of think Congress should drag them kicking and screaming into a leadership role, or they should just do it themselves.
Well, I would go a step further. I think, having worked at the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after 9/11 to try to bring all of this stuff under one tent, except it didn't, by the way. Congress refused to put all of immigration under one department. So, by the way, there are 5 cabinet departments that run our immigration system. Mm-hmm. State Department, Labor, Justice, DHS, and DOL. Oh, no, HHS, yes, HHS, sorry. I knew I had them at one point. And of those 5 cabinet departments, they come under 4 different appropriations bills in Congress and about 35 different committees in Congress. So what we have said is we need to create a migration office in the White House that is equivalent to the NSC. Because in the White House also it's not unified. The Domestic Policy Council believes that they have control over immigration, except there's a border security office in the National Security Council. So they fight all the time about who's in charge of this. Forget it, take it away from both of them. One office created by Congress so that it has to continue from government to government, from president to president, who can bring all of this under one roof to create coherent policy and single budgets. Because guess what? We tried to figure out what the entire budget for all of immigration in those 5 cabinet departments are for the federal government. It's almost impossible. It's almost impossible. If you ask me how much we're spending on immigration, I would have to, literally, you have to go through thousands of pages of documents from the government and from Congress. And even then you're only estimating because they lump other things along with it. That's stupid. That's ridiculous. And we're not going to solve it when you have cabinet departments who go, that's not my problem. Which is what happened under the last 2 administrations before this one, and I guarantee you it's still happening now, is that DHS was struggling with the people at the border and was asking the Justice Department, which oversees the immigration courts, can you do anything about speeding up the immigration cases? And they went, nope. Literally, I was in a meeting and they said, well, we really can't do that because somebody might sue us if their case was waiting and we're now prioritizing the new arrivals. And we're like, really? But no one would make them work together. So, again, when I say our immigration system is not working, forget how it was designed to work, it's just not working.
So I don't know if this is the right follow-up question for that, but David, why don't you take a stab here? Looking to the election, we talk about things working and where we go from here. What should we expect when it comes to immigration and the election? Is there a path forward to achieve policy change from your perspective?
Well, it's going to be a challenge, right? Because anytime it's an election issue, one side sees an opportunity, and they're not going to try to take that opportunity away by solving the issue before the election. We've already seen that play out. And I would say that right now, most of the country is looking at immigration as charity. Like, we are doing something for the people who are coming. And I think the whole paradigm has to change, and people's mindset have to see this as an opportunity. But because of our contorted immigration laws, you have people who are ready and willing to contribute to this country. We got almost 9 million open jobs right now. And yet we got people who are unemployed because the government won't give them their work permits. We release them from our custody. We say, we don't have the resources to deport you right now, or you're going to have a case that's going to be scheduled for a hearing a decade from now. But there's no legal authorization for you to contribute anything or work. And so then they end up in New York City shelters, and they're taking on all this burden, which is unfair to New York City, but New York City at the same time is encouraging it by advertising that they have this policy of providing people with hotel rooms who just showed up in the United States. So my view is you have to change how you're talking about this. And my view is people are contributors to this country. And the way you sell that politically is to show people examples, show people who are coming and contributing, and whether it's in the fields, whether it's at construction sites, whether it's as CEOs, whatever the case might be, these are people who we want in our country and want to build our economy going forward.
So I think, I've said this before, but I think one shift is that we've seen one side of the electorate become radicalized around immigration, in part because of these fear responses that I mentioned earlier. There are people, many millions of Americans, who genuinely believe that we have an invasion at the southern border by migrants who are being imported by Democrats to vote illegally en masse in the elections to overthrow the United States. And they believe it at the core of everything that they stand for. And the problem is that that is a thing that gets people out to vote, because you are threatening to destroy their country. And of course, this isn't true. It's not, and like, this is the sort of thing, you can argue invasion, and there are people who say this, I say, look at the Ukraine, and you say, this is an actual military invasion. There are multiple military invasions occurring globally right now, and not a single one of them looks like what's happening at the southern border. Not one of them. There are no drone strikes going on right now. We don't have people in trench warfare, in Brownsville. If you go to Brownsville, if you go to Texas border towns, people are going out for happy hour. They're having normal days. They're picking their kids up at school. It's basically life is normal, although there are, of course, people who are impacted by this. There's ranchers whose fences have been cut, and so they're very serious, genuine concerns, but they're not an invasion. And I think that is something that has become, unfortunately, the defining aspect of the debate right now. And as the election goes on, you're going to get this one party that really is focusing heavily on this fear response. And like, how do we respond? How do we crack down? What are the things we can do to stop this invasion of people who are coming here to destroy our country? And the other party, to by and large extent, doesn't really believe that. And it says, maybe thinks, I think at this point now, after the last 18 months, we've shown it wants to do something. They want to crack down somehow, but they are still acknowledging that we're at the end of the day, we're talking about people. And so this is an enormously difficult dynamic because it's asymmetric, unlike something like abortion, where you do have the parties who are sort of symmetrically polarized on it. One party is deeply in favor of the abortion, the other party is not. With Democrats right now, about 22% of Democrats in polling support increased immigration, net. That's net support. That means about 60-40 Democrats are in favor of immigration. On the Republican side of things, it is a negative 63% support for increasing immigration. That means about 80-20 against. And as you can imagine, when 80-20 is a lot closer to 100-0, and 60-40 is a lot closer to 50-50. And so you have a lot more ambivalence, I think, on the Democratic side, which means that it's not getting them out of bed in the morning to vote. And on the Republican side, you have people who this is the defining issue that gets them out of bed in the morning to vote. And that means you have a very rocky dynamic here, because it's hard to say whether the sort of exhausted middle, how they're going to view this. I do think most people, when polled, do not think that migrants are here to murder us in our sleep, but there are some people who do. And unfortunately, they tend to be the primary voters.
So when I started working in immigration policy, I work at a place called the Bipartisan Policy Center. Okay, so that tells you where I try to be. But immigration was a very bipartisan issue. And when I say that, you had people in both parties that supported expanding immigration, and you had people in both parties that supported restricting immigration. And so every time we tried to kind of figure out how we could get a majority for one of these comprehensive immigration bills, we were balancing in both parties. It was building out from the middle. How do we grow the vote from the middle? What has happened since really I'd say the early 2000s is that the parties have diverged. And Aaron said it's not like abortion where it's pro and anti. I would argue it's very much like abortion. Because it has become, until probably the last 18 months, Democrats were the pro-immigration party and Republicans were the anti-immigration party. And it was a litmus test, especially in the primaries, where if you're going to be a Democrat, you can't admit there's a crisis at the border because that's giving into the Republican narrative. And if you're a Republican, you have to be all for the border wall and all for kicking people out and all for cutting down on asylum, and immigrants are, gonna come and kill you in your bed. Like literally, there's a lot of that in the electoral, in the elected leadership, in the party dynamics that has just forced the parties to be on these opposing sides. There are people in both parties who are trying to work across the aisle, and I talk to them every day. But that group has gotten a lot smaller than what it used to be, and they have a hard time when their leadership and an election year, and you're trying to get out your base, is giving messages that say, don't work with the other side. Here's what I will say. In the last decade and a half, we have seen single party control of Washington. Both Republicans had it and Democrats have had it. And at no time has either party, when they controlled all of the federal government, gotten their preferred immigration thing passed. They've gotten nothing passed. So when I hear anybody say, we can fix this problem if you just elect more of our party, they're wrong. They're wrong, because they had that control and didn't do it, or couldn't get it done. So it's not about one side or the other. We have to, if immigration becomes this, you're either for it or against it, then there's no chance of solving it. We have to get back to a place where it's not about are you for it or against it. It's about what kind of system should we have. What should be the criteria? And we can debate that, we can argue that, but it can't be it's this or that and nothing in between, or I'm right and you're wrong, or my perspective is right and your perspective is wrong. Everybody has their own perspective, that's fine. Let's try to have a common set of facts if we can do that. We've given you some data today, hopefully you're incorporating that into where you're thinking, but have some real conversations. Why do you feel this way? What is your concern? Why are you concerned about this? What leads you to believe this? And then, well, what do you think it should be? If we can get out of the mire we're in now, which is an unproductive debate, and get back to a debate about these ideas and values, you can have a more productive debate. It's on all of us to make our leaders do that. Because right now, the incentive for them is not to do that because they get reelected, mostly, when they come back to you and say, we tried to get it done, the other side wouldn't let us, but if you send me back, we'll get it done this time, I promise.
Thank you. Sorry, Aaron, to cut you off, but everyone's been real patient with my questions. We do need to get to the Q&A.
Yeah.
I might suggest we do a little bit of a lightning round when a question comes in. If one or two of you want to respond, that's great. Certainly, if all three of you, I'm not going to restrict you from doing that. But do we have any questions? We have some mic runners on the sides. If you could raise your hand, we will get a microphone to you. Looks like we have a couple over here. We've got one down here.
Thank you. I wonder if you could comment on this. We have citizenship birthrights. Somebody comes in the country, is born here. My question is for something to ponder. If someone is coming in under refugee status and is in line, or someone comes in illegally and a child is born here, should that child then have citizenship rights?
I'll jump in because I am very clear. I think the answer is yes. And in fact, I think birthright citizenship has been one of the greatest successes of this country. Not every other country does this. You know, this is built off of English common law. This has been the case in the United States for years. But it has allowed us not to have what other countries have right now, which is populations of people essentially in second-class status. This has been a big issue in Germany for years, where they don't have birthright citizenship. You actually have to have, your parents have to have had legal status. So Germany has, and a lot of countries in Europe that don't have this, do have racialized sort of almost second-class citizenry who don't have access to the sort of the full suite of benefits that being a citizen provides. And so when you do that, you do lead to essentially the creation, this is as I think the phrasing was used in Plyler v. Doe, a permanent underclass. And we recognize that we benefit is that even if somebody is undocumented and they're here without legal status, their child will grow up as an American. They'll learn English like with all their peers. They will feel American, just as American as someone who come here whose parents had legal status. And so I think it has actually kept us from having these kind of long-term problems. Every generation, of course, faces discrimination as they come here, and then their children become Americanized. And I think if we disrupt that cycle by getting rid of birthright citizenship, I think we cause more problems than whatever small benefit in maybe welfare or benefits along that we might potentially save monetarily. I think we lose out much more broadly.
I would ask what problem getting rid of birthright citizenship would solve. If the idea is that the children of undocumented immigrants would not be citizens and that would somehow encourage them or their parents to leave the country, there is absolutely no evidence to that effect. Would it prevent people from coming? No, because by and large, most people are not coming to have their kids here. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but most of the time that's not what's happening. The people who are having their kids here are the people who came to work and then created a life here and then had kids here. But just to put a point on this, when I got to the Bipartisan Policy Center, we had a bipartisan task force on immigration that was co-led by Condoleezza Rice. And I remember her explicitly saying, I would not want my country to say to somebody, we want you never to have the rights and obligations of citizenship. And, you know, as an African-American woman, I took that very much to heart. So I think that, one, if the idea is somehow it's going to deter unlawful migration, I think that's an incorrect idea. If it is the idea that somehow they're less deserving, if they're growing up here and they're American in everything but a paper, how does that serve us? And, you know, so I think that's where I come in on it.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question? I think this one down here.
Frankly, there's nothing you've said tonight that gives me any sense of hope with regard to leadership by elected officials. So my question is, on the theory that sometimes politicians see a parade and get out in front of it, are there any groups forming a parade around the issue of comprehensive immigration reform that might have standing and power in the political system?
I mean, I'll tell you this. After the failure of the last comprehensive immigration reform in 2014, I saw this giant tent of organizations that included all the way on the left and the right that was rowing together to get it done, split apart. And primarily into Democrat left-leaning organizations and Republican right-leaning organizations and lonely people like me sitting in the middle. So I don't see that right now. That's not to say there aren't people that would support it. But right now, what I see, at least at the national level, is a lot of organizations who are hunkered down and trying to protect against bad stuff from happening rather than promoting good stuff to happen. Where that is happening is at the local level, in places like this, where you all will go out and have a conversation after this, probably like, wow, that was interesting. What solutions would I propose? That's what I hope you'll go out and do. And then you'll talk to your neighbors. What solutions would you propose? We focus an awful lot on the problems. Let's start thinking about what the solutions are and ask hard questions about those solutions, and then go talk to the elected officials here in Grand Rapids, in the state of Michigan, and then to your elected federal officials and say, what are your solutions? Tell me how that solution would fix, what problem are you trying to solve? Here's the problem I'm trying to solve. What solutions are you proposing? How's that going to solve the problem? Will that solve the problem I'm trying to solve? But don't let them get away with saying a talking point that, well, I would do 3 things that would solve this thing immediately. Not happening. Not happening. We didn't get here overnight. We're not solving it tomorrow. Or I tried to do this and the other side won't let us, because that's a cop-out too. That's finger pointing. We have to hold people accountable, and you have to hold them accountable by talking to them, by going and showing up at the town halls and the meetings in their offices, calling them up on the phone, writing your letters, but also you have to hold them accountable when you vote. If your member of Congress doesn't have a record to show that they've actually co-sponsored a bill, maybe with the other party, to try to solve this, because that's something that could get done, or, what have they done? Then do they deserve your vote? And I don't care what party they're coming from. That's what we should be asking.
And really quickly, I just want to build on the part about local, because we've talked a lot about national politics and national immigration, our immigration system, because it is federal. But the most exciting, interesting, innovative new solutions and ideas that have happened in the last decade have been at the local level. You have offices of New Americans springing up around the country, welcoming ordinances. Grand Rapids now has a welcoming coalition committee that is working on these policies. And so you have had rights to counsel instituted for people so that no one has to face deportation without a lawyer. All of this is happening at the state and local level. And I think that is where you can get engaged, because if the federal government, if Congress continues to sit on its hands, the states don't have to. You can do positive change at the local level to make communities more welcoming for people.
But there's a big but there. Only the federal government can give somebody status who doesn't have status.
Yes.
Can change the legal immigration system. So as much as that has helped people on the ground, feel more comfortable and welcoming, if they're still at danger of being deported, no matter what representation they have, then you haven't fixed anything. If the border is still a problem because our legal immigration system has changed. If people can't employ workers because either don't have work authorization or they can't sponsor somebody because the system is limited and there's not a category for them to sponsor, then that has only be changed at the federal level. So one of the things that has frustrated me is that I have seen in the last decade, since 2014, this focus on state and local, which is great, because I think movement at the federal level has to start at the ground level. But don't take your eye off the ultimate solution, which has to come from Washington. You have to make them work. They're happy to do nothing. They're really happy to do nothing.
Another question?
I strongly believe that solutions are found in civil discussion. So thank you for coming today. My question is, are there any issues, what is the purpose of the interview process and citizenship test? And are there any issues that these present, and what are possible solutions to these issues?
We got to point to you, the former attorney, on this one.
Yeah, I think that, what are the purpose of the citizenship test? We have to show that you've learned English and show that you've learned some civics. I think the grand idea is that, in moving from a green card to a citizenship, you have to show that you've put time and effort into learning, what is America, and I don't know, does that work? It's hard to say, because of course you can just remember, the test is 100 questions. They're all posted online. The answers are all posted online. You just have to memorize them. But I guess the idea is that in learning them, that said, most Americans can't pass it. If you actually do this study, most people who were born here or went to school here can't do it. And some of them are easy. Some of them is like, what city is the Statue of Liberty in? That's an actual question on the test, which, because I was practicing in New York City, nobody got that one wrong in New York. So I guess this question is, what does it mean to make people jump through a hoop that's like a lot of people in this country can't do? I don't know. And so do you need to keep it that way exactly? I don't think so. I think there are different ways to measure civic engagement, to measure knowledge and background. Do you need that to be an American citizen? It's a good question to be asked, and I think I just have to think about it a little bit more.
So we actually did some interesting research looking at how other countries, their process of getting permanent residence and then citizenship. A couple things the United States does differently than other countries. We don't make you learn English or we don't test that you've learned English until you ask for citizenship. You can have a green card your entire life and never get tested on English. But if you want to become a citizen, we test you then. Other countries have that language test before you can get permanent residence. Now that's an interesting thing, because what we say is we probably expect that you'll come here and you will learn English along the way, and then at some point in the future you'll get citizenship, and by that time you will have learned enough English to do it. Still, English is probably number one reason why many permanent residents don't apply for citizenship, because they don't feel they have enough English to pass that English language piece. The civics piece is a similar thing, because if you become, my husband's a naturalized citizen, when you become a US citizen, you are saying my allegiance is now to the United States. And it's not just that you get to vote or you get to have a government job, although that's part of it. You now have obligations. We talk here about engaged citizenship, educated citizenship. Being a citizen has responsibilities, not just rights. And we want people to understand that. And some of that is, yes, you have to memorize the 100 questions, but the hope is that you go beyond that learning those 100 questions means that you know something about the government, about our history, about who represents you and what they do. Those are important things for a citizen to know to be an engaged citizen. It's the base level, guaranteed. But I think those are important things, because we are unlike other countries. We allow anyone from anywhere to become a US citizen. You can become a citizen no matter where you came from or how you got here, if you get a green card first. And that is not common in the world. And so we do have, I think, an obligation to say, this is the last test before you're fully a part of us. And I do think there's something to be said for that.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. So I'll pop down here.
I first want to say thank you guys. I'll stand up. I first want to say thank you guys for coming out here. I love having talks about touchy subjects. I feel like that's more needed in society. Though what you brought up was a very interesting question of, do immigrants really need to know English to survive here? I feel like that's a controversial question, and I think I want to hear more about it.
I think immigrants do need to learn English to survive here. Well, not to survive, but to become fully a part of the country, because setting aside whatever a national language is, it is still the #1 language spoken in the United States. And it is internationally also still the language of most international business and trade. So I think to become fully engaged as a citizen, learning English allows you to be much more participatory. Is it absolutely necessary? No, absolutely not. There are people that live their whole lives, again, never become a citizen, don't necessarily learn full English and not fluent. I don't think English is necessarily the sine qua non of assimilation or integration. I think it's an important part of it. There are a lot of other measures of that. But I think to be a fully engaged citizen, to be effective in exercising your rights as a citizen and the obligations of citizenship, I think English is more than helpful. I would say that. I mean, I'm fully on board with a polyglot country, but I do think that, you know, for now, that it is the common language of a country that is made up of so many other countries. It's the commonality.
I will note, you actually don't need to learn English. If you
There are
reach a certain,
exceptions.
there are exceptions.
There are
actually.
exceptions.
If you reach a certain age and you've been in the country for long enough, so if you're over the age of 65 and you've been in the country for more than 15 years, you can waive the English test entirely. And especially because that's a lot of like, they just presume once a certain age, it's more difficult to learn languages because you're allowed to bring your parents over. And you're allowed to bring your parents over, and a lot of people bring parents over to care for their children. And it's not expected that you're going to have to force grandma to like learn a language that she doesn't, you know, when grandma's 75 and caring for the little one, she doesn't need to learn English if she wants to become a citizen.
There are exceptions. That's true.
David, thoughts about English?
I was just going to say that I would make the citizenship test process much more difficult. I was going to point out the exceptions. I think in order to fully participate in the public debate, you have to know English. That's all the candidates are debating. That's what, you know, the propositions on the ballot in most states are in English. I mean, the idea that you can really be part of our democracy without knowing English, I just think it's really not true. You're going to have a side debate with your cohort that understands your language. So I think there should be a presumption in favor of letting people come here and work here and live here and contribute to this country. But when it comes to political rights, that's when you're starting to exercise power over others in our society. And that's where we need a strong test to say, are you going to be part of the political culture in the country and understand our traditions and our heritage? And that is, I mean, if you look at the citizenship test, it's not, this is 8th grade maybe level.
Should be
civics.
8th grade civics.
Yeah, maybe, and it's really not, it should be an example of what we expect from our own citizens, really. Even though I support birthright citizenship and I don't think you should have to take a test in order to vote, I do think we should be setting a high bar and saying, like, this is the standard we expect from our voters. And ultimately that would hopefully translate down to our schools and to our population at large and say, yeah, if you pass the citizenship test, you really know a lot about the traditions and history of our country. I don't think our current naturalization exam goes far enough in that respect. And right now, we let 3% of the applicants for a green card get a green card, and we let 97% of the applicants for citizenship get citizenship. So you have this huge constraint at coming in here and working and living here legally, and then the citizenship test is not quite a formality, but certainly not really a huge barrier to participating in our democracy fully. And I think I would go much further than
I would
what is
say
allowed.
that's true, except the data show that, was it 40% of eligible green card holders who could get citizenship are not naturalizing?
Yeah.
So there's a large pool of people who would be eligible, but they're not doing it. Now,
Some of that's price because
some of it's cost.
It's,
'cause
you have
not
to
cheap.
pay now $650 plus.
Some of
if
it's
you wanna
English
get a lawyer,
language, but then there are
it's
people like my
680.
sister-in-law who has been in the country with a green card since she was 12 and refuses to ever become a citizen. Even though her kids were both born here, her husband was born here, everyone else in her family naturalized, and she's like, nope, I'm never gonna do it. Like, okay.
Yeah, about a quarter of the people who are eligible don't apply, but everyone who's applying, vast majority of people who apply get it. And I think we need to think about having a welcoming country from the standpoint of when people want to come and move here and contribute, they should have that presumption given to them that you're coming for a good reason. You're coming for a peaceful purpose. We should allow a way for you to come. But when it comes to then having the political power to participate in our democracy, we really aren't that vigorous, not even remotely to the same standard that we're applying, in terms of limiting people's right to move to this country. So,
Thank you. Everyone, let's thank David and Theresa and Aaron for their time tonight. Unless I'm the only policy wonk in the room, I feel like we have just scratched the surface, which is unfortunate because we are out of time tonight. But the good news is we do have a reception set up in the exhibition hall. So when you leave here, we invite you to stay. Continue the conversation with others around you, ask more questions, probe the issues further, and also look at the back of your program and visit the organizations that each of these individuals represent. We hope you feel more empowered about the issue, and thank you again for coming, and we hope you all have a great night. Thanks.